when and where you were born.
Okay.
Because every testimony we have the survivors introduce themselves that way. So I think we're ready to go, so why don't we start?
Okay, my name is Charlotte Wollheim. I was born as Lotte Levy. I changed my name to Charlotte when I became an American citizen. I was born in Aschaffenburg, which is a town near Frankfurt in Germany. My family...
What year were you born?
I was born November 11th, 1928.
Great. So why don't we do this again and just say your name and the city and the date and the
Okay.
year you were born.
My name is Charlotte Wollheim. I was born Lotte Levy on November 11th, 1928 in Aschaffenburg, Germany.
All right, Charlotte, tell us about your family, your parents, your siblings, your grandparents. Tell us about them.
We lived in Aschaffenburg, as I said. My family consisted of my mother, my father, my sister, who was 3 years older than I, and my dad's mother, who lived with us. She was widowed, and I had a grandfather on my mother's side who lived in Koblenz. In Aschaffenburg, as well as one of my dad's brothers, Paul, lived there with his wife and her daughter from a previous marriage and their son, who was my age and actually my partner in crime. We committed all sorts of mischief.
And were you an observant Jewish family? Tell us about your Jewish
No, we belonged to a congregation. My grandmother and another relative took turns being in charge, being the president of the welfare organization connected with our synagogue. We observed some of the holidays, but certainly we're not Orthodox.
And tell a little about your family circumstances. What did your parents and grandparents do for a living, and what was your life like growing up in Germany?
My dad worked in the only department store in Aschaffenburg, which was owned by members of the family, and he held some type of position. I don't remember exactly what. And we lived a very comfortable life. We had help in the house, and it was, I mean, looking back, I can judge, but the age that I was, I really had no idea how other people lived or any comparison how we lived to judge whether we were rich, poor, or anything in between.
So go ahead and speak openly now just about your childhood, about your family, about any memories you might have.
I remember a very happy childhood, and that all came to a screeching halt in 1934, in 1936, I'm sorry, when my dad was arrested. He was the treasurer of our synagogue, and the Nazi Party sent out a notice that funds from synagogues were to be confiscated, and they indicated the time that members of the Nazi Party would be in Aschaffenburg and to take possession of whatever funds. And from what I understand, much later, there was an emergency meeting, and it was decided that the funds would be distributed among the poorest members of the congregation. My dad burnt the books, and when the emissaries arrived to claim the funds that were now part of the Nazi regime, the officers of the synagogue were arrested. I was very young, and I don't remember how long my dad was incarcerated, but he felt that it was an undeniable signal that the time for Jews to live in Germany had ended. And my mother's younger sister was married to an attorney in Spain, a German attorney who had immigrated to Spain. And my parents decided that they would go to Spain and establish a new household there. They sent my sister and me to a Waisenhaus, which means orphanage. It was a Jewish orphanage in Esslingen, which, when the public schools were closed to Jews in Germany, they also admitted children who had parents. And my parents were, their closest friends were the daughter of the director of the Waisenhaus, Theodor Rothschild. And so my sister and I were sent there in 1936.
Now, prior to this, do you recall the Nazis coming to power in 1933? Did you have any experience?
What I remember is my parents listening very intently to the radio. I didn't really grasp exactly what was going on, but I certainly sensed the tension in the house. And when I came of school age, this, as I say, the public schools no longer were an option, and I went to Jewish school. And it was not unusual for children, Jewish children coming home or on their way to school, to either be derided or actually beaten up. And I also remember parades of Hitler Youth marching along, singing songs that were in line with the politics at that time.
And did you or your sister have any firsthand experience of
I-
trouble or
I
harassment?
was never, I personally was never beaten up, nor was my sister. My sister had started public school. As I said, she was 3 years older, but also could no longer attend public school and went with me to Esslingen. Before that, I had started Jewish school in Aschaffenburg, as did she.
Would you say your family identified strongly as Jews, or did they feel very German?
My parents, there was never a question that they were German Jews. My father, although he was born with cataract on both eyes, served in the military in the First World War. He was a radio operator. Because his eyesight was so diminished, his hearing was very acute, so, which didn't always serve me well as a kid. But so being a radio operator, I guess, was a natural for him.
And despite the fact that he'd served his country in the war, the rise of the Nazis made, he felt that the family had to leave and that you were unsafe.
My parents always were Jews first and Germans second. And my father, as long as I can remember, was a news junkie. So he was very sensitive to what was going on, not only in Germany, but what led to the rise of Hitler.
Was there a sizable Jewish population in your city?
I can't answer how many Jews there were in Aschaffenburg. I was much too young to be aware of that.
Do you remember your neighbors or friends? Do you have any memories of them?
I have, the only memory I have of neighbors is there was a Gentile lady. Her first name was Kita. I don't remember her last name. And she was the only one of our neighbors. I strongly remember her friendship for us did not diminish with Hitler coming to power.
Did you have other Jewish friends?
Yes, my parents had Jewish friends, and their closest friends were this couple I mentioned before, whose Bethel's father was the head of the orphanage, and there were other friends in Aschaffenburg.
Pause while Don starts and stops the film. It's just a technical issue.
Can I?
Yeah, you can interject with questions. There's certain points that you.
When I was going to ask you if you wouldn't mind, the only thing I was wondering was the degree of Jewish observance in the home, or during holidays, during Shabbat.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us about your family's Jewish observance on a daily basis.
Back on them?
Yeah.
Oh, back on the tape.
Yeah, I mean, we can, this will all be edited if we were going to end up using it, so it's okay to.
I thought he had gone.
It's
on.
okay to interject whenever.
Okay.
Okay? Great.
In our house, we observed Shabbat in the sense that we usually had company on Friday nights and observed the Jewish holidays not in the Orthodox fashion, but in a Reform fashion. We belonged, obviously, to a synagogue, which we attended, and we were what I think would translate here in America to Reform Jews.
And did your family have any attachment to Zionism or Palestine? Was there any talk of, when your family started talking of leaving, talk of going to Palestine?
We never, again, there was a much greater distinction between children and parents and their discussions than there is in this country. So I have no idea whether the idea of emigrating to Palestine, now Israel, ever entered the conversation.
All right, so let's go back to 1936. Your father was arrested. The money of the Jewish organization is confiscated. Why don't you continue on from there, just freely and feel free to speak just freely. You don't need to be answering my questions all directly and then only answering the questions. It's your testimony, so speak openly and freely.
After the event of my dad's arrest, my parents were convinced that the time for Jewish life, normal life in Germany had come to an end. And as I previously said, my mother's younger sister and her husband lived in Spain, where he was an attorney. And my parents dissolved the household. My grandmother went to Munich, where her sister lived, and Marion and I were sent to Esslingen, the Waisenhaus in Esslingen, and all our furniture was crated and sent to Spain. My mother enrolled in a school to learn dietetics, And I don't remember in what city, but I know my dad, I think she went to Köln, and my dad went to Köln. I know they were in different cities. And of course, Marion and I were sent to Esslingen. Arriving there was very traumatic for me. Again, as I see with my grandchildren, and I've volunteered in schools as long as my children were going to school, and now with my grandchildren, so I'm well aware of the difference in sophistication between American children and European children, or at least this European child. Coming to Esslingen was a total shock because I had never been away from my parents, and I sensed that there were things going on that they had no control over, and they were my world. It was very frightening, and I remember distinctly one day, very shortly after Marion, that was my sister, and I came to Esslingen, and I was walking up the steps to the second floor, and there was a closet on the second floor. In Europe, there was no such thing as built-in closets. They were freestanding closets. And this closet stood about, maybe a foot away from the wall. And I was a very tiny kid for my age. Obviously, I haven't grown that much since, only expanded. But I scrunched into the corner, into that space, and I sat there, and I realized I was quite miserable. I was lonely. That what was happening in the world, not even my parents could control. That I had to learn to really take care of myself, that I was the only person who would always be with me. And that was it was a sobering thought and a frightening thought at the time. But looking back at age 88, I realize that it was a thought and a philosophy that has sustained me.
Now, your parents, the family dispersed in anticipation of leaving for Spain? Or was this after you had found out that you couldn't go to Spain?
No, my parents definitely wanted to go to Spain, had plans to go to Spain and establish our family there. But the events of the world dictated differently, because in 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out, and after we had sent all our furniture there, with the war, the borders were closed, and so different plans had to be made. And it took 2 more years for my mother actually to find a cousin in America who was in a financial position to be able to give us an affidavit. You could not come to America unless you had a sponsor who would guarantee that your family would never be a burden for the American government. So many times over the years, people have asked me, why didn't your family came here, why didn't more German Jews or European Jews take the same way of saving themselves? it was absolutely impossible. You had to be sponsored. Otherwise, you were unable to enter the United States.
And who sponsored your family?
In my family, there was a cousin of my mother's who was quite an adventurous young man. And from what I understand, most of the family members considered him a bit of a wild one and sort of shook their heads in despair. But my grandfather, on my mother's side, had affection for this young man. And when he came to my grandfather and asked him for money so he could go to America, my grandfather indeed gave him the money. And he, in turn, repaid my grandfather by extending his willingness to give affidavits not only for my parents, my sister and me, but also for my grandfather. But my grandfather, who was quite deaf and old, felt that he had lived in Germany all his life. He felt he knew the German character and that this was sort of a pogrom that would pass. Unfortunately, he was proven wrong. He was sent to Theresienstadt, where he died.
So how long did you remain in the orphanage with your sister in Esslingen?
Marion and I stayed in Esslingen for 2 years. The 2 years it took my parents to find a sponsor here in America.
Did you see your parents during that time at all?
Oh, my parents visited us regularly, and during vacation time, we would either visit my grandmother in Munich and her sister, or my grandfather in Koblenz, or our relatives in Aschaffenburg. And my mother regularly sent packages. I particularly remember the marzipan.
And what was it like living away from your parents and your family for those 2 years? Was it an adventure, or was it scary? Were you worried and sad, or were you just still being a child?
Being in Esslingen, of course, it was very confusing because I had never known anyone. I mean, among my friends who had lived away from parents, and I had certainly never imagined it. But the orphanage itself had a terrific school. It was very progressive. It was observant. And we had activities such as gymnastics and things that I enjoyed, met new friends, and it was, I don't think I was unhappy there. First of all, I had my sister, and then particularly the head of the school, whose name was Dr. Theodor Rothschild, was an incredibly wise man. I want to add here that he had the opportunity to come to America because his children, his 2 daughters and families were here, but he refused to leave because of his commitment to the youngsters at the Waisenhaus who had no family. And he ended up being sent to Theresienstadt with the children, and he died there.
And while you were in Esslingen, were you aware of what was going on around you in Germany at the time, or were you fairly sheltered from that?
While I was in Esslingen, while we were in Esslingen, it was a reprieve from life outside of Esslingen. We, like most children, we were busy with our activities. I had one friend in particular. Her name was Bella, and we were the bane of our teacher because we weren't as quiet as he would have liked us to be, and not infrequently were punished for that. So I think Owen was the first time that I was able to participate in gymnastics, which I adored. And I mean, there were so many opportunities, some of which I didn't take advantage of. For instance, when I came there, all the children were invited to play an instrument, and those who couldn't or wouldn't had gymnastics during that time. And the minute I heard that the alternative to music was gymnastics, I devised a way that I could get out of the music portion. And when I was asked what instrument I wanted to learn to play, I looked for the biggest, heaviest one, which was harmonica, the accordion, an accordion. And the accordions were huge, and I was little. And whoever was in charge tried to dissuade me and offered the advantages of other more manageable instruments, but I insisted that if it couldn't be the accordion, it would be nothing. And so I had gymnastics.
And how about your sister? Were you close with your sister at this time?
My sister and I, throughout our lives, were very close. My mother had said to her before we left, "Now you're in charge for the care of your sister." And I guess older siblings are by nature caring and nurturing, but that only intensified that aspect of Marion, and she was a great gift.
Did you share living space? Did you share a room? And did you share a classroom with them?
No, no. Since we were 3 years apart, I was with a younger group and with kids, as far as in the classroom, age appropriate.
Did you ever share with anyone, Marion or anyone else, that realization that you were on your own?
No, there were aspects of my personal insights that they were important to me, but I questioned how important they would be to anyone else.
So you were 2 years at Esslingen. So let's go forward now to 1938 and the events of 1938. Why don't you tell the story of what happened to your family and how you eventually ended up leaving Germany?
You know, and if I could, also, I'm curious what happened to the parents during that 36-38. If they had an awareness of what was going on.
So moving forward from 36 to 38, their parents, and then bring us up to
Did your parents have an awareness, or what was your awareness of what your parents were going through between 36 and 38? And how did the laws affect them?
Inasmuch as my sister and I were living on this island, so to speak, removed from the activities excuse me, that my parents were engaged in. The only time we saw my parents was on vacation, and that was a time of joy, and I mean, there was an undertone of uncertainty and discomfort. I don't know whether I'm viewing that now from the age I am now, or whether that was actually, I sensed that at the time, but I was not aware of what was going on, the politics, what was happening in the world. I lived in the world of Esslingen and the vacation world of Munich or Koblenz during vacation times when my parents came to pick us up and we went to see family.
Were they living in the same city?
My parents were not living in the same city because my dad kept working and my mother was going to school in another town.
So now let's move forward to 1938. Why don't you tell us about the events of 1938?
In 1938, I'm sure the adults, such as the head of the school and possibly even to some extent my sister, was made aware that the ramifications of leaving Germany and going to America, I don't really remember what preceded Marion and me leaving Esslingen, and my parents picked us up. We first went back to Aschaffenburg, where, as I said, my uncle, my dad's brother, and his family lived. And then we went to Koblenz to say goodbye to my excuse me, my grandfather, my mother's father. He lived in an apartment it was a garden apartment on the ground floor of a building. His front door was glass painted green so that you couldn't look in. On the night of November 10th, was the day before my birthday, we were all asleep when there was a loud crash. Later, I found out that members of the Nazi Party had broken in to the apartment, and I just heard the tremendous noise because to the right was the kitchen, and they went into the kitchen and literally pulled out every single glass and dish and threw them on the ground. So to be awoken from deep sleep and hear all this horrible noise, none of us knew, well, of course I didn't know, but the adults didn't know either what was coming down there. And my mother, who had put on a robe, told my sister and me to climb out the window and hide in the garden, which we did. My grandfather didn't hear anything. He was quite deaf. And my father got dressed and went to the closest police station to report what he thought was an act of vandalism. And of course, he didn't come back. My mother, who was born in Koblenz, she and my sister were going to the police station when they met a former schoolmate of my mother's, who was a member of the Nazi Party in uniform, but there was still some semblance of relationship there, and he told my mother that all the Jewish men had been arrested, that this was an organized act, not an individual act of vandalism, but something that was state organized and that my dad had been arrested. I don't remember how long my father was in jail. He was released because he had proof that we were leaving the country. And so we went, I mean, I was totally terrorized. And we went back to Aschaffenburg to bid my relatives there goodbye, and then my mother, dad, sister, and I took the train to France because my mother's sister and brother-in-law and their 2 young children. This is the same brother-in-law. They had lived in Spain. Abel was told, he was a lawyer, that he was going to be arrested by the Franco government. And they literally, with their 2 little infants, their sons are 10 months apart, in a wash basket, escaped to France, where my uncle again established a law firm. And we went to visit them on the Spanish Côte d'Azur, the Spanish Riviera, where the sun was shining. It was beautiful. And I don't quite remember how long we stayed there, but it was to say goodbye and on our way to Le Havre, from where we boarded the boat to America. But I cried bitterly when we had to leave France. This was something new but familiar somehow, and the weather and the relatives and the idea of an adventure did not appeal to me. And I must say, crossing the Atlantic in December was, I'm not prone to seasickness or air sickness, but I was retching. It was terrible crossing. And we landed in America on Christmas Day, 1938.
So back to those events of Kristallnacht. You said you were terrified, and your father was imprisoned. How long was he imprisoned? And tell more about your reaction immediately and thereafter to those events.
On November 11th, November 10th rather, Kristallnacht, I think did quite a number to my nervous system. To this day, very loud noises just terrify me. I mean, now it's much less so, but for a long time. I also have to add that the Hitler Youth in Aschaffenburg used to march whistling the songs that were part of the Hitler movement. And to this day, I hate the sound of whistling. That stayed with me. The events on November 10th to a child, to a Jewish child, with all that had preceded, again, they're traumas that don't leave you. They leave scars. And it's the unknown. And I think what is the worst thing for a child, at least for me, and I suspect for all children, is when bad things happen and you sense that your parents can't can't be in charge, that they are as much buffeted by those winds as you are. That's a very scary thing.
Your father wrote in that the letter here that you weren't able to go to school for more than.
We came to America, as I said, on Christmas Day. My father's cousin, they had come here a few years earlier and were living in New York on 163rd Street, and they had rented an apartment for us across the hall from theirs. And on New Year's Eve, my sister and I had been put to bed and were asleep. My parents were across the hall with his cousin and family when the usual New Year's Eve celebrations in New York took place. I heard the whistles and the car honking, and I was sure the Nazis were coming. And I had a total breakdown. And we had, strangely enough, the family doctor we had in Aschaffenburg had immigrated to New York quite a number of years before, and he again became our family doctor. And he was exceedingly cautious. And I was supposed to have a tonsillectomy. And he convinced my parents that I had to build myself up for this bit of surgery and that I should go to school only in the morning between needing the tonsillectomy and the breakdown that I had, that I should rest in the afternoon. I don't know that there's a doctor here in America who would endorse that treatment today, but that was his recommendation. He was a lovely man.
What do you mean when you say you had a breakdown?
I was hysterical. It was diagnosed as a nervous breakdown. I was just totally inconsolable. I was sure that any minute now the Nazis would break through the door and take my parents.
How long did that go on for?
I don't remember.
Did this ever happen to you again?
No.
One detail I was unclear about, how long was your father imprisoned after Kristallnacht, and how and when was he released? Do you recall that?
After my dad went to the police and handed himself over, I think it was a matter of my mother getting the papers together that would prove his allegations that we were on our way to America. I don't recall exactly how long he was in jail.
Do you recall parting with your grandparents?
Yeah. Saying goodbye to my grandparents was very painful. My grandmother had lived with us the first, let's see, well, as long as I could remember. As a matter of fact, my grandmother had 4 sons. She obviously felt it was all right for my mother to have a daughter the first time round. When the second child was born, and again was a girl, my mother wanted to name me Susan, but as a consolation to my grandmother for having failed to give her a grandson, she was allowed to name me, and that's how I got to be named Lotte instead of Susan. So it was, she had been a part of my life always. And my grandfather and I had a very special relationship. He had an extensive wine cellar.
This is the grandfather.
This is my mother's father in Koblenz. And when I was still in the high chair, he would pour a little either Moselle wine or Rhine wine on a spoon and see whether I liked it. And indeed, I liked it very much. And to this day, that is my drink of choice. So, and plus, he and I played cards. And he had been a really horrible father, but he was a wonderful grandfather, and I was exceedingly fond of him. We had a lovely relationship.
So tell us about more about some of your family was able to escape and some of them did not. So
My mother had 2 brothers and a sister. The eldest brother died in the First World War. The second brother, her mother died when she was quite young. My grandfather, who was wealthy, felt that it was superfluous to hire someone to take care of the 2 younger children when he had a perfectly capable daughter. She was taken out of school, though she wanted to study to be a doctor, and she basically took care of the house and raised her younger siblings. The brother, who indeed became a doctor, and he and his wife and young daughter emigrated to Palestine, Palestine in the early 30s. The youngest, my aunt, was quite adventurous. She worked for a newspaper and was sent on assignment to Spain, where she met her husband, and they married and lived in Spain. They, as I said, escaped when Franco came to power and lived in France. And then when the Second World War broke out and Hitler invaded France, they wanted to come to America, were unable to find a sponsor, and we were economically in no position to sponsor anyone, so they emigrated to Chile. My father's other brother, he had one brother who was married, and they had no children. He emigrated to Ecuador with his wife. And then one brother, Paul, had married a Gentile widow with a daughter by first marriage, and they then had a son. When Hitler came to power, Inge, my cousin by Kata's first marriage, could no longer live in her stepfather's house because no Gentile child was permitted to live in a Jewish home. So she went to Gentile relatives. Inge and I really had no close relationship. She was about at least 6 years older than I, and so there was no area that we had in common. But my cousin, and second child with Keita, and I were the same age. And as I said, we played together. Ernst was hidden in a monastery. Keita stayed with my uncle, Ernst, and my uncle Paul, rather. And he was hidden. He, of course, was not given a ration book, but Keita shared her rations with him. She, unfortunately, was killed in an air raid. I have to take some water.
Hold on. Can't get up yet without the microphone.
Good.
So your uncles were hidden. What happened with them?
He remarried after the war his first wife's sister, and they had another boy.
So he survived the war.
He survived the war being hidden.
In a monastery.
No, my cousin was hidden in the monastery. I don't know where my uncle was hidden. This whole family died tragically. My aunt, as I said, his first wife died in an air raid. His second son he was a newsboy, and he was killed in an automobile. He was run over. His first son was hidden in a monastery, converted to Catholicism, married a Catholic young woman. He became a doctor, and he and my mother were in contact because my mother both wrote and read German. I can read it, not that well, but I certainly can't write it. And he noticed that he had what he thought was a wart or some growth of some kind. And after being on duty one night, he decided to go and have that removed at the hospital where he worked. And he died on the operating table. It turned out that this was a very deep-rooted cancer, very malignant cancer, so he did not survive.
You had mentioned another brother, so Paul is Lucy's brother.
No, Paul was Dad's brother.
Brad's brother.
And then Franz, they lived in Ecuador, and she died of cancer, and he, after the war, they had first lived in Switzerland, and then they emigrated to Ecuador, and he went back to Switzerland and remarried, and I visited him in Switzerland, and by that time he was already showing signs of mild Alzheimer's, and he eventually passed away.
Did he and his Swiss wife have children?
She wasn't Swiss either. She also had originated in Germany. They had met in Ecuador. They were both widowed, and she hadn't had children by her first marriage, nor had Franz. And they, by the time they married, that train had left.
So why don't you tell us about the fate of your relatives who decided not to leave, including your grandparents?
Well, my grandfather, as I mentioned, even though he had an affidavit, felt confident. He had confidence in the people he had known all his life in Koblenz, and he was deported to Theresienstadt. My grandmother had no opportunity to leave, and she and her sister, who lived in Munich, were also deported to Terezin. And through a friend in Switzerland, I don't quite know how, or maybe through the Red Cross, my dad knew that she was there, and he was running all over trying to find someone who could sponsor her. Finally found a sponsor who was willing to give her an affidavit, but then through a notice from this person in Switzerland, he was notified that she had died. It was the only time in my life I ever saw my father cry.
After you arrived in New York, did you remain in contact with your grandparents back in Germany?
It was impossible. You couldn't, there was no communication possible. You could only hear through someone in a European country, and I don't know how my mother found out. Well, she found out that the date on which the deportations in Koblenz took place, and then I can only surmise that it was through the Red Cross that she found out.
You have the letter, though, from your grandfather.
That was before he was, I have a letter from my grandfather after we arrived in America, before he was deported.
So was there much correspondence before he was deported?
There may have been correspondence, I'm sure there was, between my parents and their parent, but you know, I was, for 2 years, I was in Esslingen, and then by the time we came to America, when I started going to school, first of all, because I didn't understand a word of English, I was put into a grade 2 years below where I should have been. And bad as my memory has gotten, I remember the name of Mrs. Appel, my first teacher in America, who made my life hell. She, I think, was 5 minutes before retirement age and felt put upon to have this little refugee kid who was 2 years older than every other kid in her class, didn't understand a word of English, foisted on her. And in that class, the only child, my only classmate, who had the courage to befriend me was a little African-American girl. This was the first time I had ever seen an African-American. And I'm grateful to say that it colored my view of African Americans. I will forever be grateful to her.
So you lived in New York during and after the war. Can you describe what it was like, what you were hearing about the war and your family's reaction during and after the war?
Well, the war years, living in New York, in those days, you still had civics. That's no longer a subject isolated in today's school.
My daughter's taking civics now.
Civics?
mandated in Washington State.
Wow.
Sorry,
That's
just an
the
aside,
first
but
I've heard. Usually it's part of history or
new.
and part of our daily assignment in that class was to report back on an article we had read about the war. The only kids in that class who came fully prepared, not exclusively because of the assignment, were the German refugees. The American kids, and normally generalizations are foolish, but somehow in this case it applied. America had always been an island unto itself. They really felt no connection to the war. It was a subject that was unending in our house. My father, the eternal optimist, when America entered the war, of course, we were all vastly relieved, felt no matter what happened that day, America would be the victor. And on days when the news was bad, this was really annoying. But his optimism never wavered. His faith in the justice of America winning the war never wavered. We were totally immersed in reading the paper, listening to the radio. It was as much part of our daily lives as food and sleep.
And do you recall when you first started hearing about the fate of the Jews of Europe or of your family's fate?
Both Marion and I belong to Jewish youth groups that whose burning mission was to get the Allies, and particularly America, involved in rescue, and particularly after the Kindertransport, which, by the way, my second husband, Norbert Wollheim, organized in Berlin. And on the one hand, we were all Democrats, of course, and behind Roosevelt, but more so behind Eleanor Roosevelt, who we felt had a real feel for what was happening to European Jewry. But we were also aware of the Congress, which was dominated by the solid Southern Democrats who were reactionary.
And as word began to filter out from Europe as to what was happening there with the Jews of Europe, do you recall hearing about that during and after, especially during and after the war?
Well, during the war, not so much, other than guest rabbis at our synagogue, some of whom were involved in leadership positions in organizations that try to send help, food, clothing, etc., etc. But for the most part, that news only came out after the end of the war. The Jewish, as far as I knew, certainly the circles that I was part of, we had no idea the extent of what was happening.
Did your father learn how his mother died in Theresienstadt?
She starved to death. I mean, no one was, Terezin was not a killing camp.
Mm-hmm.
People just starved.
And did he know what her fate was at all? What it was like for her?
No. No, all that only came out afterward.
When your parents said to their parents, "We're leaving," did they try to persuade their parents to, or their respective parent to go along?
My grandmother had no opportunity. There was no sponsor for her. My mother indeed tried to convince my grandfather, her father, but he wasn't to be moved.
And he perished at Theresienstadt, or was he deported from there?
No. The
No what?
the German Jews, for the most part, were left in Theresienstadt and Terezin. The Polish Jews and Jews from some of the other countries were sent to the death camps.
When did your mom find out the fate of her father?
I think quite some time after the end of the war. The Red Cross was very active in getting information out. I don't know exactly when or from whom my mother found out that her father had perished.
So let's continue in your story to start talking about your husbands. Tell us first about your first husband, Jeff's father, and his story and how you met him. And
I met my husband, Henry Sprung, who he was the only son of a family in Leipzig. Both his parents had emigrated to Leipzig from Poland. They were born in Poland. I suspect that they were brought to Germany, possibly by their parents. Anyway, they had lived in Germany for a very long time. His father was one of 10 children. The sons and the grandfather, my late husband's grandfather, had a haberdashery business. They both manufactured and sold menswear. The sisters' husbands, there were 4 sons and 6 daughters. The sisters' husbands were hired by the brothers and the father. In other words, there was a social distinction between the bosses and the employees. And they all lived in Leipzig. I don't know whether my in-laws died when they died. I don't know whether either or both died before deportation. I think they must have, because my father-in-law, there was a law promulgated in, I'm not quite sure when, that all Polish Jews living in Germany were deported back, really dumped back into Poland. and Henry and his family were among those. However, by that time, yeah, his father must have been dead, because when the time came for the Germans to take over the Sprung business, they brought back that Sprung family, my in-laws, so that the transfer would be legal. My father-in-law was brought back so he could sign over his business to the Nazis. Henry and his father and one of the uncles were deported together. And they first went to Dachau. And on the day, I don't know whether they were already in Auschwitz on the day that the German official in Poland was shot by a Polish Jewish man. And as a revenge for that act, both my father-in-law and his brother were shot. Henry came back from a work detail, and they had to line up. I mean, if there's one thing that Germans were notorious for, it was order and counting and counting and counting. And when he came back from work detail, he noticed that his father and uncle were in a different line than the one he was ordered to get into. And he went over to be with his father and his uncle, and one of the Nazi guards cuffed him in the ear and said, "Are you crazy? Do you want to get killed too? Get back into your line." That's the last time he saw his father. And it was one of the 2 times that a German saved my husband's life.
Can we go off the record? That's what we call it. Can you stop for a moment?
Okay, we're rolling. So now tell us Henry Heinz's story, and then we'll move on to...
He, the second time that his life was saved, he was actually in the hospital. And the way that, I forget what it was, that his life was saved was the way the Nazis always had room in the hospital is that they killed off the present patients to make room for the others, and a doctor hit him. He actually met the man I would marry many, many years later in Buna, where they both worked for IG Farben. And when that camp was being cleared, as the Americans or the Russians were coming, the Nazis marched the inmates further west. And Henry and Norbert and one other man heard guns in the distance one night, and they ran. And that's how they saved themselves. Henry's mother's uncle.
What were the guns?
The Americans. Or maybe the Russians, I don't know. The Henry's uncle on his mother's side had early on moved to Denmark. And when the war started, he was ferried into Norway many Danish Jews were saved that way by Danish citizens.
To Norway or to Sweden?
To Sweden, I'm sorry. And then he went back to Denmark, and one night, he had shared his story with friends, and one of his friends heard Henry's name being read off of a list from the Red Cross of survivors of that particular area. And that's how he learned that his nephew had survived. He got in touch with the Red Cross and arranged for Henry to come to Denmark. He was a single man, and he really wanted Henry to stay with him. Henry stayed for about a year, but he was anxious to leave Europe, and so he came to America. He had relatives here by then. And he and I actually met because he was going out with a friend of mine, and he broke off with her. And then we met on a ski trip, and he called me for a date, and I knew that she had been going out with him, and she wasn't happy that he had broken off with her. So I called her, and I said, he called me for a date. He doesn't mean anything to me. You're my friend, and if that's going to create a problem, I just won't go out with him. And she said, well, obviously he's not going out with me, so he might as well go out with you. Didn't work out that well. Henry and I did well, but our friendship kind of went down the tubes. And when we became engaged, we were engaged and unengaged about 3 times. And finally, my sister was married in Milwaukee that same year, and we went to Milwaukee, and while I was listening to the ceremony, I decided that this yo-yo engagement just was not going to work. And I came back. I had said to Henry from the get-go that he needed some therapy. And being the German macho, that was not for him. But when I told him that I'd had it, that I was no longer willing to participate in this situation, he said to me that he had found the family doctor who had been his family's doctor, and he had talked to him, and he said to him, you have to go and talk to someone and get some help. And he did, and we did. Unfortunately, we had 3 sons, had a really lovely life, and then he was diagnosed with lymphoma. He lived 2 more years, and a week before our oldest son's bar mitzvah, he died. And then the 4 of us pulled together and went on as best we could, and my oldest son was very mature. But 3 years later, he was killed in an automobile accident at camp. And I remember on the day of his funeral, I went into his room and I sat down in his bed and I thought to myself, I can't do this anymore. And I had always been a student of history, particularly Jewish history. And I thought of all those who had come before me and what they had had to endure over the centuries, and that I had inherited some of their strength. And that helped. And we went on.
And then how long was it before you met Norbert?
Oh, I had determined that, I was 8 years younger than my husband, my first husband.
Refill your glass.
Thank you. And I,
Hold on a second.
thank you very much. I determined that whatever time and energy I had to go into making sure that not only my sons would grow up, but would grow up with a sense of hope and be able to maximize the gifts given to them. So I had very close friends in Saginaw. It was like a family. And I was not interested in dating, and that just was not on my list of important things. Particularly my older son was really having such a hard time. Jeff is the youngest, and the youngest really has a great advantage. And I met Norbert when Henry and I were first married, because they had been in camp together. And then both Henry and I did not like living in New York. So we moved to Milwaukee when we were married less than a year. And our sons were born in Milwaukee. And then later on, we moved to Saginaw, Michigan. But I maintained a relationship with a couple whom Henry had met after he was liberated. And they lived in New York, and I told them that I was coming to New York. One of my friends, a social worker, was going to a social worker meeting in New York, and she said, "Why don't you come along? We'll have a weekend of it." And I said, "Okay." And I notified these friends, and they said, "We're having a get-together, and you and Sharon come." And I came, and that's when I met Norbert again. Oh, I should say, years before that, when I was visiting my parents who lived in Santa Barbara, I was leafing through the Aufbau, a German Jewish newspaper, and I saw where there was the obituary for Norbert's wife, whom I had also known. So I sent him a note of condolence, and he wrote back, "Let's stay in touch." And we really didn't stay in touch. But we met again that evening, and he took us back to our hotel, and Sharon went upstairs, and he and I sat till all hours of the night catching up. And then we established a telephone conversation relationship, and sometime after that he proposed and I accepted.
Tell us just briefly about Norbert and his activity before, during, and after the war.
Norbert was in law school in Berlin when Hitler came to power. He was married, he had one child, a second on the way. And he left law school before he was thrown out because the handwriting was on the wall. And he and his father had been very active in the Jewish community. And the powers that be there came to him when England made the offer of taking Jewish children after Kristallnacht, and said that they wanted him to organize that in Berlin. And he said, well, I'm trying to find a way to get my wife, my child, and myself out. And they said, if you do this for us, we will in turn then help get you out. And he did, and he organized it. He went on a number of transports with kids, and of course, before the quota was met, the war broke out, the borders were closed, and he, his wife, and child were deported to Auschwitz the day they landed there. His wife and child went to one side, he to the other, never saw them again. And he was in a somewhat privileged position because he knew how to speak and write English. And he was, I don't know, he ended up working for I.G. Farben, and that's where he met Henry. He, when the war ended, he and another man, they were in the British sector, were named by the British Army of Occupation to be in charge of the survivors in the British zone. And he met his second wife, who had been in a camp, and they married, and actually had 2 children while they were still in Germany. And it took a while. There had been one man whom, I don't know what type of illegal actions he was taking, a Jew who had survived, but he was caught by the British, and he blamed Norbert for the fact that he had gotten caught, and he emigrated to America, and Norbert's application to come to this country during the McCarthy era, he said that Norbert was involved with the Communist Party in Germany. So that set back the plans for his being able to immigrate to America, but eventually he did. As a matter of fact, he was on tour for bonds for Palestine or what, I forget. I mean, he's always been politically active and was a very committed man, very wise man. As I said, my first husband was 8 years older than I. My second, 16 years older than I. I figured I better stop. But he was a very active in the American Gathering of Jewish Holocaust Survivors in New York. Did a lot of speaking on behalf of Israel bonds.
Tell us about after the. Did you ever go back to Aschaffenburg after the war?
Every 5 years, the city extends an invitation to its former Jewish citizens. And for the longest time, I just was not ready. And then 13 years ago, I asked Peter, my older son, if he was interested in coming with me to Aschaffenburg. Oh, before that, when Norbert was still alive, he and I and 4 of our friends met in Europe, and we went to Aschaffenburg, we went to Berlin, we went to Budapest, where my closest girlfriend is Hungarian. So that was, I think that was my first, no, the first time I went back to Germany I was in Copenhagen visiting my husband's uncle, the one who, by that time, Henry had already died. And my uncle, my mother's brother-in-law, they're the ones who were in Spain, and by now they had emigrated to Israel. And Abel, as I said, was a lawyer with incredible language skills. And he was working for the Israeli government on restitution cases. And he also was bringing a restitution case on behalf of his wife and my mother. So he said to me that he needed me to give a deposition. I was in Copenhagen, and I said, okay. He said, I'll meet you at the Frankfurt airport, and then we'll go on to Koblenz, where this deposition would take place. And just as an aside, I arrived in Frankfurt way before he did. We never did catch up in Frankfurt. And I'm waiting, and I'm waiting, and I'm so uncomfortable. So finally, I decide to go into a telephone booth and call. He had given me the name and phone number of the law firm with which he used to be associated, where he still had a friend. And I thought, maybe this man would know where my uncle is. And I'm trying to figure out the telephone system. And a very irate German opens the phone booth and says to me in German something to the effect, you know, are you going to come out of there? Or I mean, he was irritated and voiced his displeasure at the length of time I was in the telephone booth. And I thought to myself, well, I won't voice what I thought to myself. But I smiled, and I opened my purse, and I took out a quarter, and I smiled at him, and I said, "I'm sorry, I don't understand your language. I hope this will be of help." Handed him the quarter and closed the door again. He probably thought I was some crazy person in there. And I thought, I feel I don't want to be in this country. I'm unhappy here. Anyway,
So
my
how did that man make you feel?
angry that, the first time I was done wrong by Germans, I was a little kid, a helpless little kid. Now I'm an American. I'm visiting your country, and damn it, you owe me courtesy. That's how he made me feel. I finally caught up with my uncle, or he caught up with me, and it was too late. There were no more trains to Koblenz. So he said to me, he was born in Landorf, and he said, let's take the train there. I'd like to go to the cemetery there. So we went to Landorf, and what was interesting about the Catholic Church in Germany is that they had records of all the citizens, not just Catholics, but all the citizens of that town. So Abel and I went to the Catholic Church. It was a tiny little town. And he wanted to look at the records of the Jews from that. And we did go to the cemetery. And then we went to a boarding house to rent rooms for the night. Now, this was my first night back in Germany. I went to sleep, and I woke up. I was terrified. It was as if every murdered Jew was in the room with me. I was beside myself. I got dressed. I waited for my uncle to get up, and we went to Koblenz. I gave my deposition, and we were supposed to go on to Switzerland to a resort where his wife was waiting for us. And Abel said, "It's too late for us to go tonight. Today we'll stay overnight in Koblenz and leave in the morning." I said, "No, I'm not staying another night here." He said, "Where are you going to go?" I said, "I'm going to the airport, and I'm going to fly to Zurich. And if I can find a room there, that's fine. If not, I'll sleep at the airport. I am not spending another night in Germany." But since then, I've been back to Germany 3 times. And I admire the mayor of Aschaffenburg enormously, because he has made a crusade of seeing to it that the lessons of the Holocaust are taught in the schools. There is a commemoration, including the Boy Scouts, every November 10th. And he's really has changed the atmosphere so much so. The first time I went with Peter, the second time Hava, Jeff's daughter, was here when the invitation came, and I was telling her about it, and she said, "Oh, can I go?" And I said, "That's up to your father." I said to Jeff, there's always an invitation for two. So I said, if you want to come with me, Hava will be my guest. And the three of us went. And at lunch, we went to a restaurant next to the hotel where we're staying. And a look into the New Germany. Our waitress was an African young woman, beautiful young woman, speaking perfect German. So things have changed.
Is your old apartment, did you visit any sites that you remember from your childhood in Aschaffenburg?
As luck would have it, the hotel where we were put up was exactly across the street from where the apartment was, but I did not go in. I wouldn't have remembered anything. As a matter of fact, the first time we came back to Aschaffenburg, and my cousin, the daughter of my aunt, who wasn't actually my cousin, my uncle married her mother, we reunited, which was lovely. And she said to me, do you realize that that's your apartment? I said, really? And she was pointing to the rooms, and she said, and that was the music room. I said, music room? What kind of music room? She said, that's where the piano was. I said, who played piano? So I didn't, obviously that was something that had been erased.
Okay, Charlotte, excuse me. You mentioned a story of your sister finding a Kiddush cup. Can you tell that story?
Marion went back to Aschaffenburg once, and she, oh, no, that was when we came back from from Koblenz after Kristallnacht, and my dad was back with us. We came back to Aschaffenburg as the final farewell and walked to where the synagogue had been, which was totally destroyed. And they kind of, my parents and my sister kind of walked around. I was always the coward of the family. I stayed as far removed from anything that frightened me as I could. And that was a very scary sight. And under the rubble, Marion bent down and she found a Kiddush cup that had belonged to the temple. And was that, I'm not sure whether it was then or it must have been then, but she took it, we took it home, and then she took it with her when she married, and the first time she went back to Aschaffenburg, she brought the Kiddush cup back. And now the plaza where the a synagogue used to stand, of course, you can't see any traces of it, but the rabbi's house has been converted into a museum. And she turned it over to them, and when we were there, I saw the Kiddush cup on display. And I said to the young woman who was our guide, I said, "Do you know the story of this Kiddush cup?" And she didn't. So I regaled her with it. It also, on display there, is a picture of the last class, and my sister and I are, of course, on that picture. So I'm a museum piece before my time.
What's it like going back and being in Aschaffenburg for these commemorations? How do you feel?
I was, the night before there was going to be a mass deportation, there was an organized leaders of the community came together and committed suicide. And they now have graves in the Jewish cemetery, as do the Torahs that were destroyed. It was a mixed bag. There was there are no Jews in Aschaffenburg. They're just remnants of what was and will never be again. I have the daughter of this cousin of mine continues to live outside of Aschaffenburg. She married an American GI from Alabama. She talks English with a combination German, American Southern accent. And she and I formed an instant bond. So I feel I have family there. And she was very, very close with my uncle. She viewed him as her grandfather, and since mothers and daughters not infrequently butt heads, he was her go-to guy. And that, I'm sure, has also impacted our relationship.
Any other reactions or memories of being back there and your feelings about any commemoration ceremonies or interactions with Germans from your hometown?
You know, Germans who are older than I are dead. And the young, their slate is clean. So I don't, I have an unending sorrow for what happened. And a fear of echoes that are happening in this country. But as far as going to Aschaffenburg, I must say, being there with Hava and Jeff was heartwarming. And the people who are involved in the commemorations are so devoted and serious in their efforts to make sure that history is remembered and learned from, that I'm enormously impressed.
Charlotte, tell me about your work with Vladka Mead.
Norbert was invited to, this program that Vladka Mead had, she
To explain who is Vladimir.
Vladka Mead was a Polish woman born in Warsaw, highly intelligent, who, when the Germans invaded Poland, it was she, her mother, father, and a younger brother. And after the Germans, as I say, invaded Warsaw and freed the Polish Nazis, because the Germans didn't have to teach anti-Semitism to the Poles. Her father went out one day to get bread, and he was beaten up. And that totally destroyed his spirit. And after that, Vladka was the one who went out, who did, and so on and so forth. Her father died before the Warsaw Jews were put into the ghetto. So he actually had a decent burial. Her mother, brother, and Vladka were taken into the Warsaw ghetto. And Vladka spoke Polish without a Jewish accent, which was very rare, because the Polish Jews spoke Yiddish primarily, and so their Polish reflected that. Vladka neither looked Jewish nor sounded Jewish, and she joined the underground. She had a very adventurous life. She came back from one of her missions, and her mother and brother were gone, but the food was still on the table, so she realized it must have happened very, very recently. She ran out to the gathering street and to try to find them. And she was held back mercifully. But she never forgave herself, because she had promised her mother that they would be together. She continued in the underground and survived. And she actually met Ben, who was also in the underground during all this. And they lived together and married. And Ben, when they came, they went to South America. I think Ben had family there. And I don't know what business they were in, but evidently doing very well. And Ben, who was a very shrewd businessman, also did very well. And they then emigrated to America. And Ben and some other survivors organized the American Gathering of Jewish Holocaust Survivors in New York. Vladka worked for the Jewish Labor Committee and had a Yiddish radio program. She decided that she wanted to start a program to incorporate the study of the Holocaust into American public schools. She got backing, and the American Federation of Teachers in New York were very strong supporters. And her office was at the Jewish Labor Committee. Jewish Labor Committee had been active during the war, trying to make contacts with Jews in camps and doing a lot, as much as they could. She started this program, and they had a reunion which was co-sponsored by the Holocaust Museum in Washington for teachers who had gone on this program. And Norbert was invited to be one of the guest speakers. I went with him, of course. I was blown away by the commitment of these teachers from places I had never even heard of here in the United States. The program was exceedingly well organized, and when we got back to New York, I wrote Vlatka and thanked her for the opportunity to be there, and told her that it's my firm belief that if there's any hope at all for our planet, it can only be through education. And if there's ever anything I can do to assist, she should call on me. The next day, I started out as a volunteer and then went to work with her and actually went with her on the trips to Poland and Israel each summer.
What was it like in going to Poland with teachers? Tell a little about those trips.
We would go to Warsaw and then take the bus to Auschwitz and to Treblinka and to Majdanek. It's devastating. Each year it got harder because, you know, you read about it and you see the undeniable capacity of man's inhumanity, and it is devastating. It's a life-changing experience. Vlatka had tremendous courage. She was very, she could be a firebrand, but very self-effacing. She, you know, anyone with a PhD, you would have thought that person could walk on water, and here she was, this poor little person. I think she was as bright, if not brighter, as most of them. Fiercely devoted to the teachers. They adored her, but were scared to death of her. Anything that came up that they didn't want her to know, they called me. She was an amazing, amazing woman. It is such a privilege to have been in her orbit for the years that I worked with her. Just a remarkable person. Unfortunately, she became afflicted with Alzheimer's. I had promised her that I would not retire before she did. She was older than I. And then Hava was born. And I said to her, you know, this is really hard. I waited a long time for a grandchild. And a year and a half later, Levi was born. I said, Hava, Vlatka, I can't do it. Gotta go there. And I would call her every week. That was my treat for the week to myself. And not all that long after, she knew who I was.
Yeah. So I think we're gonna wrap things up. Do you have any thoughts, additional things that you would like to discuss or?
Well, I would like to add that Ben Mead was a tremendous supporter of this program. He traveled with us and made a very large contribution to the program, and it's ongoing.
Do you have any general messages that you'd like to just record about the importance of studying the Holocaust, of Holocaust education, of why what we're doing is important, or any message that you'd like to impart? This is your chance to.
I think Holocaust education is important because we have to be aware of both the potential for good as well as evil in even the common man, and to be aware and to be active in teaching and really helping each other.
And anything you'd like to say to children who might view this, or even your grandchildren?
The message for children is the same as for adults. Each of us has an obligation to educate ourselves, to recognize that it really doesn't make any difference what church you go to, or if you don't go to church, what color of your skin. We're all on the same journey. Our beginnings are the same, our ends are the same. It makes it so much more pleasant if instead of turning our backs, we extend a hand. And you can only do that when we learn about each other.
Well, thank you, Charlotte. I'd like to get her holding some of these documents as well.
You need to, yeah, okay. All right, we're rolling now.
This rather raggedy-looking document is the affidavit. The affidavit meaning it is a guarantee by a cousin of my mother's who was well established in America and could prove that, if necessary, he could be our support, our means of support, so that at no time we would be a burden to this country. And it is a document that was required before anyone at that time could enter this country. It's really a document that spelled our lives.
Could you hold it down just, yeah, just a little, yeah, thank you.
This is my citizenship paper. It was a wonderful day when I became an American citizen. I was able to legally change my name from Lottie to Charlotte, and now had the rights and privileges of calling myself an American.
That's it.
That's it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Charlotte. This went really well.